What happened inside this roadside motel room will shock you. The motel sat along a fading highway outside Flagstaff, Arizona, a place drivers passed without remembering. In late autumn, one occupied room became the focus of an investigation that never fully closed. What happened inside room 11 was reconstructed later through records, interviews, and conflicting testimony. No official report ever described a clear sequence of events. Daniel Mercer was 34 years old, a freelance wildlife photographer traveling between seasonal contracts. He checked into the roadside motel, reportedly seeking rest, before heading north to document winter migration patterns. Dispatch logs show his phone last connected to a local cell tower shortly after sunset. The front desk clerk recalled nothing unusual about him, only that he asked for a quiet room. State records confirm he paid cash for 2 nights. The second person tied to the case was Lila Henson, age 29, a substitute teacher from Prescott. County file notes state she was driving alone toward Utah to visit her sister after a school term ended. She later told investigators she stopped because her car overheated near the motel. Some locals claimed they saw her speaking with Mercer near the vending machines that evening. Investigators never confirmed whether the two knew each other before that night. A third individual appears only indirectly in archived notes, a man identified as Thomas Reed, age 48, employed as a night maintenance worker. His stated purpose at the location was routine repair and security checks. Reed reportedly told deputies he heard loud voices from room 11 around 11:30 p.m. Dispatch logs list no complaint calls from other guests during that window. Records conflict on whether Reed entered the room that night. According to Motel Key data, room 11 was accessed twice after midnight. The system was outdated, and investigators noted possible logging errors in state records. Lila Henson claimed she returned to her car before midnight and slept inside it. Surveillance footage from the parking lot was overwritten within 72 hours. Some locals claimed the motel cameras never worked to begin with. Inside room 11, investigators later documented overturned furniture and a shattered bedside lamp. There were no clear signs of forced entry, according to the county file. Archived notes mention a strong metallic odor, though no source was identified. Blood traces were reportedly found, but not enough to determine injury severity. Investigators never confirmed whether the scene suggested a struggle or panic. Daniel Mercer was reported missing 2 days later when he failed to appear at a scheduled ranger checkpoint north of the city. Park Service records show his vehicle was still parked at the motel. His camera equipment remained inside the room, undisturbed according to initial inventory. State records indicate his wallet and phone were missing. No official explanation addressed why he would leave essential gear behind. Lila Henson was questioned once and released without charges. She reportedly told investigators that Daniel appeared nervous and distracted when they spoke briefly. She denied entering his room and said she left the property early morning. Dispatch logs confirm her car was seen on a highway camera at dawn. Investigators never confirmed whether she was alone in the vehicle. Maintenance worker Thomas Reed resigned 3 weeks after the incident. Archived notes mention inconsistencies between his written statement and later interview. He reportedly claimed he smelled ozone near room 11, a detail not supported by forensic analysis. Some locals claimed Reed avoided discussing the case afterward. State records show no further follow-up interviews were conducted. Search efforts focused on nearby Forest Service land and abandoned mining roads. Rangers found no trace of Mercer despite favorable weather conditions. County file notes mention reports of unusual radio interference during the search. Investigators never confirmed any connection between those reports and the disappearance. The case remained classified as a missing person with undetermined circumstances. In the weeks following the disappearance, investigators revisited the motel several times. County file entries describe minor structural damage behind the drywall near room 11. No explanation was given for how it occurred or when. The motel owner reportedly repaired it without documentation. Records conflict on whether samples were collected before repairs. Archive notes show that Daniel Mercer had photographed unusual animal tracks days earlier near a restricted forest area. The images were stored on a memory card recovered from his camera. Some prints appeared distorted, inconsistent with known species, according to one ranger. Investigators never confirmed whether the photos were relevant to the motel incident. State records list the images as inconclusive. A separate lead emerged involving a payphone once located across the highway. Dispatch logs recorded a brief call placed at 12:42 a.m. from that phone. The call lasted less than 30 seconds and did not connect. Some locals claimed the phone produced static even when working. Investigators never confirmed who attempted the call. The payphone was removed the following year. Lila Henson contacted authorities again 3 months later. She reportedly said she remembered hearing knocking while inside her car that night. Her statement conflicted with her earlier claim of uninterrupted sleep. County file notes show investigators questioned the change but took no action. Records conflict on whether her revised account was formally recorded. Some locals claimed stress influenced her memory. During a routine audit, state records revealed an unlogged maintenance entry for room 11. The timestamp fell between 1:15 and 1:40 a.m. Thomas Reed denied making the entry when contacted by phone. Archive notes state he ended the call abruptly. Investigators never confirmed if the system error was human or technical. The audit report offered no conclusion. Park rangers later reported finding Mercer's jacket near a seasonal creek bed. The location was 12 miles from the motel and difficult to access on foot. The jacket showed no signs of tearing or blood. Dispatch logs indicate the item was logged but not photographed. Records conflict on whether the jacket was verified by family. Investigators never confirmed how it reached the area. Some locals claimed unusual lights were seen near the tree line that same week. These reports were included in archive notes but marked as unverified. Investigators attributed them to distant vehicles or equipment. No formal interviews were conducted regarding the sightings. State records show no attempt to correlate times or locations. The claims remained anecdotal. A private investigator hired by Mercer's family reviewed county files 2 years later. His report noted missing timestamps and altered page numbers. He reportedly suggested evidence handling errors rather than misconduct. Investigators never responded publicly to his findings. State records acknowledge receipt of the report without comment. The family declined further interviews. Room 11 was eventually renumbered during a motel renovation. No plaque or marker references the incident. New management stated they were unaware of the case details. Archive notes confirm original records were boxed and stored off-site. Some locals claimed guests still request Room 11 out of curiosity. Investigators never monitored those requests. As of 2024, Daniel Mercer remains missing. His case file is still open but inactive, according to state records. No charges were filed and no official cause was determined. Dispatch logs end without resolution. What occurred inside that roadside motel room remains undocumented. Investigators never confirmed whether anyone else knows more than what was recorded. In later years, former motel guests came forward with fragmented memories. One truck driver reportedly recalled hearing a sharp impact against a wall that night. He said it sounded heavier than a door slam. His statement was never added to the official county file. Records conflict on whether investigators considered him a credible witness. Archived weather data shows temperatures dropped rapidly after midnight. Investigators noted exposure risk if Mercer had left the motel on foot. No footprints were documented around the building despite soft ground conditions. State records list this as an oversight rather than evidence. Some locals claimed wind erased any traces before sunrise. Investigators never confirmed the timeline. A forensic review of the room occurred 6 months later. By then, furnishings had been replaced and walls repainted. Archive notes indicate trace testing was no longer possible. Investigators acknowledged the delay, limited conclusions. County file entries suggest budget constraints influenced the timing. No supplemental report followed the review. Dispatch logs show one unanswered radio transmission from a ranger unit during the initial search. The transmission contained only static and cut off abruptly. Investigators attributed it to terrain interference. Some locals claimed similar interference occurred near abandoned mine shafts. State records do not show further investigation into that claim. The matter was closed administratively. Daniel Mercer's family continued informal searches for several summers. They reportedly focused on water sources and game trails he might follow instinctively. No personal items were recovered during these efforts. County file notes mention family frustration with limited cooperation. Investigators never confirmed whether all search data was shared. Records conflict on agency coordination. Lila Henson eventually relocated out of state. A brief follow-up interview was conducted by phone. She reportedly said she avoided thinking about the motel entirely. Her tone was described as controlled but hesitant in archived notes. Investigators never classified her as a suspect. No further contact was recorded. Thomas Reed was later linked to unrelated employment disputes. None involved criminal allegations, according to state records. Archive notes mention difficulty locating him for additional questioning. Investigators never issued a subpoena. Some locals claimed he changed his name. That claim was never verified. Inconsistent evidence handling became a recurring theme in internal reviews. County file summaries reference misfiled photographs and duplicated forms. Investigators acknowledged procedural weaknesses. No disciplinary actions were documented. State records show the department updated protocols the following year. The Mercer case was cited internally without detail. A final lead surfaced when hikers reported hearing voices near the creek at dusk. Rangers searched the area and found nothing. Archived notes classify the report as environmental audio distortion. Investigators never confirmed the source. Some locals continued to avoid the area afterward. No official advisory was issued. The motel still operates under a different name. Room 11 no longer exists on the floor plan. County file closure notes state there is insufficient evidence to determine events. Dispatch logs offer no final entry. What happened that night remains unresolved within official records. Investigators never confirmed whether the full account was ever known. Years after the incident, a retired deputy reviewed old dispatch logs for training purposes. He reportedly noticed time gaps that did not align with standard logging intervals. The gaps were not flagged during the original review. State records indicate the deputy raised the issue informally. No amended report was created. Archived motel invoices show an unscheduled power reset during the early morning hours. The reset affected only one wing of the building. Investigators initially attributed it to aging infrastructure. Records conflict on whether Room 11 was included in that circuit. The motel electrician could not be located for follow-up. The matter was noted without resolution. A former park ranger later stated Mercer had asked about restricted zones days earlier. The ranger recalled the questions as unusual but not alarming. Archive notes include this recollection without corroboration. Investigators never confirmed the conversation through written records. State files list the ranger's statement as supplemental. No further inquiry followed. County file entries reference a handwritten note found in Mercer's car. The note listed coordinates without explanation. Investigators attempted to locate the area with no results. Records conflict on whether the coordinates were accurate or incomplete. The note was returned to the family. No copy remains in evidence. Several months later, a utility worker reported finding a damaged flashlight near a service road. The item matched the model Mercer owned. Dispatch logs show the report was acknowledged. Investigators never recovered the flashlight. Archived notes suggest it may have been discarded before retrieval. State records do not clarify the outcome. Public interest briefly increased after a regional news segment aired. The segment cited missing person statistics and rural motel risks. Some locals claimed the coverage overstated known facts. Investigators issued a brief statement reaffirming uncertainty. County files include a transcript of the broadcast. No new tips were logged afterward. An academic researcher later requested access to anonymized case data. The request was partially granted. Archive notes show several pages were withheld. Investigators cited privacy concerns. Records conflict on what criteria were applied. The researcher published no findings related to the case. During a wildfire evacuation years later, the surrounding area was searched incidentally. Crews found no remains or personal effects. Dispatch logs mentioned terrain disruption from previous fires. Investigators noted that any earlier evidence may have been destroyed. State records classify this as an environmental limitation. The search yielded no updates. Mercer's disappearance continues to appear in internal training materials. It is referenced as an example of incomplete data. County file summaries emphasize procedural caution. Investigators never attributed fault to any individual. Records conflict on whether earlier intervention could have changed outcomes. The case remains instructive rather than resolved. No additional witnesses have come forward in recent years. The motel incident is rarely discussed publicly. Archived notes end with a recommendation for periodic review. Dispatch logs remain unchanged. What occurred inside that roadside motel room remains unsupported by definitive evidence. Investigators never confirmed whether the truth was lost or simply unrecorded. The Shawville Farmhouse Disturbance. The Ottawa Valley sits along the boundary line that separates Quebec from Ontario, a region defined by its rugged terrain, dense woodlands, and a history of hardscrabble agriculture that demanded resilience from the families who settled there in the 19th century. In the late autumn of 1889, the landscape was already turning gray and brittle with the approach of winter, and the farming community of Shawville was settling into the seasonal rhythm of harvest and preparation for the deep cold. It was a place where reputation meant everything, and where the practical demands of survival left little room for superstition or flights of fancy. The people who lived there were Methodists and Presbyterians, grounded in a strict work ethic and a literal interpretation of the world around them. This context is vital to understanding the events that centered on the farmhouse of George Dagg, a 30-year-old farmer who was, by all accounts, a typical, hard-working member of the community. He lived in a modest wood frame house approximately 7 miles from the village of Shawville with his wife Susan, their 2 young children, and an 11-year-old Scottish orphan named Dinah Burden McLean, whom the family had taken in to help with chores. There was nothing remarkable about the Dagg farm, nothing in its history or its construction that suggested it would become the focal point of one of the most rigorously documented unexplained episodes in Canadian history. The disturbance did not begin with a storm or a dramatic omen, but with the mundane details of daily life shifting slightly out of alignment. It started on a Sunday morning in mid-September, a time when the light was clear and the house was quiet. The family noticed that a distinct, pungent smell of manure had permeated the kitchen, seemingly without a source. Upon inspection, they found smears of wet filth appearing on the floorboards, fresh and glistening, in rooms where no one had walked with muddy boots. George Dagg initially assumed this was a prank or a result of carelessness by the children, perhaps even Dinah, though the girl denied it. He cleaned the floors only to find the filth reappearing minutes later in a different pattern. It was an annoyance, a hygiene issue that frustrated Susan Dagg, but it was not yet frightening. It was merely a domestic puzzle. This low-level harassment continued for days, escalating slowly from smears of mud to the displacement of small objects. A jug of milk left on a secure table would be found overturned or moved to the floor. A butter crock was found with its contents smeared, the lid hidden in a different room. The family tried to rationalize these events as the actions of a mischievous child, and suspicion naturally fell on Dinah, the outsider in the family dynamic. She was a quiet girl, often described as timid, and she became the focus of George's early frustration. He disciplined her, believing that the chaos was her doing, a cry for attention or an act of rebellion. But the activity did not stop when Dinah was under observation, and it soon moved beyond the capacity of a young girl's sleight of hand. The situation shifted from domestic annoyance to genuine danger on the afternoon of September 15th. The family was gathered in the main living area when they saw a large jar of pickles, which had been sitting securely on a shelf, lift itself into the air. It did not fall, it was launched. The heavy glass jar flew across the room with significant force, shattering against the opposite wall. As the family stood in the debris, stunned by the impossibility of what they had just seen, a second object, a flat iron used for pressing clothes, was hurled from its resting place. It struck the floor with a heavy thud, missing the children by inches. This was the moment the atmosphere in the house changed from frustration to fear. George Dagg, a man accustomed to dealing with the tangible problems of farming, broken fences, sick livestock, bad weather, found himself confronting a force that had no physical form but possessed physical strength. He searched the house, looking for wires, for hidden strings, for any mechanism that could explain the movement. He found nothing. The house was structurally sound. There were no intruders. The windows were shut, the doors were bolted, and yet the interior of the home had become a firing range. The phenomenon escalated rapidly over the next 48 hours, introducing a new and far more terrifying element: fire. It began with small, inexplicable combustions. A window curtain in the parlor suddenly burst into flames. There was no fireplace nearby, no candle, no match. The fire seemed to ignite from within the fabric itself. Susan Dagg rushed to extinguish it, beating the flames out with a rug. Before the smoke had even cleared from the parlor, a second fire started in the bedroom upstairs. Then a third in the kitchen. The family spent the entire day running from room to room, battling spontaneous ignitions that targeted flammable materials, paper, cloth, bedding. The fires were not large initially, but the frequency was overwhelming. In a single day, 8 separate fires broke out within the house. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was immense. The family could not sleep. They could not eat. They were trapped in a cycle of panic, waiting for the smell of smoke that would signal the next attack. It became clear that the house was no longer safe, and George Dagg made the decision to move his wife and children to a neighbor's home for their safety, leaving him to guard the property. But the activity did not cease with the family's departure. It seemed to anchor itself to the location and, specifically, to the presence of the young girl, Dinah. Word of the disturbances at the Dagg farm spread quickly through the tight-knit community of Shawville. In a rural settlement, secrets were hard to keep, and the sight of the Dagg family fleeing their home drew attention. Initially, the neighbors were skeptical. The idea of spirits or poltergeists was not something that sensible farmers entertained. It was viewed as superstition, or worse, a hoax concocted to cover up domestic troubles. However, as the stories grew more intense, curiosity drove the neighbors to investigate for themselves. They did not come to gawk. they came to debunk. Men like Arthur Smart, William Dagg, and Charles Bowie, respected figures in the region, arrived at the farm with the intention of exposing the trickery. They were practical men who knew how the world worked. They set up watches, sitting in the kitchen for hours, observing every corner of the room, watching Dinah closely to ensure she was not moving her hands or throwing objects. They expected to catch a child in a lie. Instead, they became witnesses to the impossible. One of the most documented incidents during this period involved a large stone that smashed through the kitchen window while a group of men was present. The men immediately ran outside, expecting to find a prankster hiding in the bushes or behind the barn. The yard was empty, the fields were clear, there was nowhere for a person to hide. They returned inside, unsettled but still looking for a rational explanation. As they stood discussing the event, another stone struck the house. This time, they noticed something peculiar about the trajectory. The stones did not seem to be coming from the outside in the traditional sense. Witnesses reported that some stones seemed to materialize in mid-air or pass through the glass without shattering it, only to fall heavily onto the floorboards. Other times, the glass would shatter, but the stone would land gently, rolling to a stop as if it had no momentum. The physics of the interactions were wrong. The force required to break the window should have sent the stone flying across the room, yet it simply dropped. The men, who were familiar with the mechanics of throwing and impact, could not reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew to be true. The skepticism of the community evaporated as more people experienced the phenomena firsthand. It wasn't just one or two impressionable individuals, it was a collective experience. A document was eventually drawn up, a formal affidavit signed by 17 witnesses attesting to the reality of the events. These were not anonymous sources. They were the heads of local families, people with reputations to protect. They swore that they had seen fires ignite without cause, stones thrown by invisible hands, and furniture moving of its own accord. This document remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the case, a testament to the fact that whatever was happening at the Dagg farm was an objective reality, not a subjective hallucination. The sheer number of witnesses made it impossible to dismiss the events as mass hysteria. They stood in the room, they felt the heat of the fires, they dodged the flying objects, they heard the sounds. As the physical manifestations continued, the nature of the haunting evolved. It shifted from telekinetic violence to something more intelligent and communicative. A sound began to permeate the house, a low, guttural noise that initially resembled the growling of a dog or the grinding of heavy stones. Over time, this sound refined itself, sharpening into a voice. It was not a human voice, or at least it did not sound like any human the family knew. It was described as gruff, masculine, and varying in pitch. It seemed to come from empty space, sometimes from the ceiling, sometimes from the center of the room, and occasionally it seemed to emanate from the vicinity of Dinah, though witnesses repeatedly checked her mouth and throat and found them motionless. The voice was crude and often obscene, shouting profanities that shocked the conservative religious sensibilities of the onlookers. It mocked the farmers, calling them by name, revealing personal secrets that a stranger could not have known, and engaging in arguments with those brave enough to speak back. The arrival of Percy Woodcock, a well-known artist and amateur psychical researcher from Brockville, marked a turning point in the documentation of the case. Woodcock had heard reports of the Dagg mystery and traveled to Shawville with a skeptical but open mind. He was a man of education and culture, distinct from the rough-hewn farming community, and his presence added a layer of analytical observation to the chaos. Woodcock did not just watch, he engaged. He spent days at the farm, recording the events with a meticulous eye for detail. He witnessed the movement of objects, the sudden fires, And, most disturbingly, he conversed with the voice. Woodcock's accounts describe a presence that was mercurial, sometimes angry and violent, other times strangely docile and even theological. He noted that the entity seemed to have a split personality. At times, it claimed to be a devil, reveling in the chaos it caused. At other times, it sang hymns with a terrifyingly beautiful clarity, its voice changing timbre to sound almost angelic. One particular afternoon, Woodcock conducted an experiment to test the intelligence and perception of the entity. He took a pencil and wrote a question on a piece of paper, hiding it from view so that no one in the room, especially Dinah, could see it. He then asked the voice to answer the question. The voice, emanating from the empty air near the ceiling, correctly answered the written query. Woodcock repeated the test with different questions, shielding his actions, and each time the voice responded accurately. This suggested to Woodcock that the entity possessed a form of clairvoyance or telepathy, able to perceive things that were not physically visible. It was not merely reacting to the environment, it was observing it on a level that bypassed normal sensory channels. This intelligence made the threat feel significantly more acute. It wasn't just a blind force of nature, it was a conscious observer that was watching them, listening to them, and reacting to their thoughts. The focus on Dinah Burden McLean became increasingly intense during this phase. The entity often claimed that it was there for her, sometimes threatening to take her away, other times claiming it belonged to her. The psychological pressure on the 11-year-old girl was devastating. She was the center of a storm she could not understand, blamed by some for the events, feared by others, and terrified by the voice that seemed to hover over her shoulder. Yet, despite the suspicion that she was somehow the source, the physical evidence often exonerated her. On one occasion, a heavy harmonic organ was lifted and tipped over, while Dinah was visibly standing on the other side of the room, surrounded by witnesses who were holding her hands to ensure she did not move. The sheer weight of the organ required two grown men to lift it back upright. An 11-year-old girl, even if she had been free to move, could not have generated the force necessary to tip it. The phenomenon was using her as a focal point, but it was operating with a power that exceeded her physical capabilities. The interactions between the entity and the family reached a bizarre peak when the voice began to demand specific actions. It would order George Dagg to perform tasks, or it would demand food. In one disturbing instance, a piece of buttered bread was placed on a table as a sort of offering or test. Witnesses watched as the bread was lifted into the air by an invisible hand. Bites appeared in the bread, disappearing into nothingness, accompanied by the sound of chewing and swallowing. The bread was consumed in front of their eyes, leaving only crumbs. This biological mimicry, the sound of breathing, the sound of eating, the capacity to speak, blurred the line between a spectral haunting and a physical presence. It was as if the entity was trying to build a body for itself out of the available energy in the house. It was becoming more solid, more undeniable with every passing day. The climax of the haunting occurred in mid-November, roughly 3 months after it began. The intensity of the disturbances had reached an unsustainable level. The fires were constant, the noise was deafening, and the crowds of onlookers were disrupting the entire operation of the farm. The entity, which had engaged in long theological debates with Woodcock and the family, began to show signs of changing its demeanor. After weeks of profanity and violence, the voice shifted toward a more somber, almost repentant tone. It began to speak of departure. It claimed that its time was ending. The shift was as baffling as the arrival. There was no exorcism performed, no ritual cleansing that drove it away. The dynamic simply exhausted itself. The voice announced that it would leave on a specific date, promising peace to the family that it had tormented. On the final day, the atmosphere in the house was heavy with anticipation. The family and the assembled witnesses waited, unsure if this was another trick. The voice spoke for the last time, offering a final farewell that was strangely devoid of the malice that had characterized its earlier interactions. It sounded weary. Then the sounds ceased. The house, which had been a cacophony of banging, crashing, and shouting for months, fell into a profound silence. The heavy, oppressive feeling that had hung over the property lifted. George Dagg checked the rooms. The fires had stopped. The objects sat still on their shelves. The air smelled only of the wood stove and the cold autumn wind outside. The presence was gone. The aftermath of the Dagg haunting left the community of Shawville with more questions than answers. The signed statement by the 17 witnesses was published in the local newspapers, the Times, Pontiac Advance-Times, and others, serving as a public record of the impossible. These men put their names to a document that could have ruined their reputations, swearing that they had seen the laws of physics violated. They described the events not as a ghost story, but as a series of facts. The fires happened, the stones were thrown, the voice spoke. There was no attempt to embellish, only to record. Percy Woodcock left the farm with his notes, deeply affected by what he had seen. He had arrived a skeptic and left convinced that he had interacted with an intelligence that defied scientific explanation. George Dagg and his family remained on the farm. They did not flee the region, nor did they capitalize on the fame of the event. They simply went back to work. The crops needed to be harvested, the animals needed to be tended, and the winter was coming on hard. They repaired the broken windows, scrubbed the soot from the walls, and replaced the shattered crockery. Dinah Burden McLean grew up, eventually marrying and moving away, leaving the shadow of the haunting behind her. But the story remained, etched into the local history of the Ottawa Valley. It was not a legend whispered around campfires. It was a matter of public record, supported by affidavits and newspaper reports. What makes the Dagg case distinct is the lack of resolution regarding the nature of the entity. It did not fit the traditional mold of a ghost of a deceased person returning to right a wrong. It had no clear identity. It was elemental, chaotic, and trickster-like. It played with the family, terrorized them, debated them, and then simply lost interest. It was a raw intrusion of the unexplained into the mundane reality of rural Canadian life. The image of the hardy farmers, men of the soil and the Bible, standing in a circle in a drafty farmhouse, watching a jar of pickles fly through the air and listening to a disembodied voice sing hymns, remains one of the most striking and surreal tableaus in the annals of North American paranormal history. The silence that followed the departure of the entity was absolute. There were no recurring anniversaries, no residual hauntings. The farm became just a farm again. But for those who were there, for the 17 men who signed the paper and the family that lived through the fire and the noise, the world had fundamentally changed. They had seen the curtain pulled back, revealing a chaotic, noisy, and intelligent darkness waiting just behind the veneer of the everyday world. The Dagg Farm disturbance stands as a testament to the reality of the inexplicable, a moment when the impossible forced itself into the lives of ordinary people and demanded to be acknowledged before vanishing back into the gray mists of the Ottawa Valley. The Dagg Farmhouse Disturbance. The winter of 1,889 inches, the Ottawa Valley was harsh and unforgiving, a season where the cold seemed to seep through the walls of even the sturdiest homes. In the small community of Clarendon, Quebec, specifically in the Shawville area, the farmhouse of George Dagg stood isolated against a landscape of snow and timber. It was a modest structure, typical for a hardworking farmer trying to support a wife, 2 young children, and an adopted girl named Dinah. For years, the rhythm of life at the Dag farm was dictated entirely by the demands of agriculture and the weather. There was nothing to suggest that this specific plot of land would soon become the center of a chaotic and terrifying series of events that would draw witnesses from across the region and leave a permanent mark on local history. The trouble did not begin with a storm or a sudden accident, but with small domestic anomalies that were easy to dismiss at first. It started in September, a time when the harvest work usually occupied every waking thought of the household. The first sign that something was wrong was purely financial, or so it seemed. George Dag found a banknote he had left on a dresser torn into pieces. It was a frustrating discovery, one he initially blamed on a mischievous child or perhaps a rodent, though the tears looked deliberate. He pieced the money back together and tried to put it out of his mind. But the atmosphere in the house began to shift rapidly after that. The air felt heavier, and the family started noticing strange stains appearing on the floorboards. It looked like red paint or blood, appearing in spots where no one had been standing. George scrubbed the floors, confused but not yet afraid. He asked his wife Susan if she had spilled anything, but she was just as baffled as he was. The stains would be cleaned away only to reappear hours later in a different pattern. It was a nuisance, a bizarre housekeeping issue that defied explanation, but it was not yet threatening. As the weeks pushed toward November, the activity escalated from passive stains to active movement. The family would be sitting at dinner when a jug of milk would slide across the table on its own. It did not tip over immediately, but moved with a steady, deliberate friction against the wood before crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering pottery became a common backdrop to their evenings. Objects that had sat on shelves for years suddenly seemed to lose their grip on gravity. A jar of pickles flew from a cupboard and smashed against a wall while the family was in the next room. Susan Dag began to fear for the safety of the children, particularly the young boy, John, and the little girl, Mary. But the activity seemed strangely focused around the presence of the 11-year-old adopted girl, Dinah. Whenever she was in a room, the air seemed charged with a static tension that preceded the movement of objects. The community of Clarendon was tight-knit, and rumors began to spread that the Dag family was struggling with something they could not handle. George, a proud man who valued his reputation, was reluctant to ask for help. He tried to rationalize the events. He looked for loose floorboards that might cause furniture to wobble. He checked the foundation for settling that might explain the sliding objects. He looked for drafts that could knock things off shelves. But his rationalizations collapsed when the fire started. It was mid-November when the phenomenon took a dangerous turn. Smoke began to curl up from unexpected places inside the house. A window curtain burst into flames in an empty room. George rushed in to douse it with a bucket of water, his heart racing. Before he could catch his breath, he smelled smoke coming from the bedroom. A pillow on the bed was smoldering. These were not sparks from the fireplace. The fire started in the middle of fabrics, far from any heat source. Over the course of a single day, the family had to extinguish nearly 10 separate fires. They broke out in clothing, in bedding, and even in piles of paper. The terror was immediate and visceral. This was no longer a curiosity. The house itself seemed intent on consuming them. Exhausted and fearing they would burn to death in their sleep, George made the decision to evacuate the main house. He moved his family into a shed on the property, hoping that the distance would provide safety. They carried only the essentials, leaving the haunted farmhouse to stand dark and empty in the cold November night. But the reprieve was short-lived. The phenomena followed them. The shed offered no protection. As the family huddled together, stones began to rain down on the roof. It sounded like a hailstorm, but the sky was clear. Then, the stones started coming inside. They did not seem to be thrown through the door or windows in a normal trajectory. Witnesses described the stones as appearing in midair or dropping straight down from the ceiling. They were smooth river stones, some small, some large enough to cause serious injury. George went outside, scanning the perimeter of the property, convinced that someone was playing a cruel prank. He expected to find a group of local boys hiding in the bushes or behind the barn. He found no one. The snow around the shed was undisturbed, yet the stones continued to batter the structure. Desperation drove George to seek help from the wider community. He realized that if he did not get outside verification, people would think he had lost his mind. He invited neighbors to come and see for themselves. At first, people were skeptical. They arrived expecting to find a family gripped by hysteria or a hoax orchestrated by the children. What they found silenced their doubts. Arthur Smart, a local skeptic, arrived at the farm determined to expose the trickery. He stood in the main room of the farmhouse, which the family had cautiously re-entered during the day. As he stood there, a stone the size of a hen's egg flew across the room and struck him. He could not determine the source. He watched as a wash basin rose from its stand and crashed to the floor. Smart left the farm shaken, his skepticism replaced by a deep unease. Word reached a man named Percy Woodcock, a well-known artist and an amateur investigator of the unexplained who was staying in Brockville. Woodcock was a man of education and intellect, not easily swayed by country superstitions. He heard the reports coming out of Clarendon and decided to travel to the Dag farm to document the events firsthand. He arrived with a notebook and a critical eye, prepared to dismantle a fraud. Instead, he became the primary chronicler of one of the most intense hauntings in Canadian history. Woodcock arrived in the aftermath of the fires, just as the phenomenon was shifting into a new, more disturbing phase. The physical assaults were continuing, but now the entity was beginning to communicate. Woodcock spent days at the farm observing the family dynamics. He noted that Dinah seemed to be the epicenter. She was a quiet girl, often looking exhausted and frightened. When she was present, the activity spiked. Woodcock witnessed stones floating through the air, moving with a trajectory that defied physics. He saw them turn corners and slow down before hitting a target. He noted that while the stones often hit people, they rarely caused significant pain, as if the force was dampened at the last second. It was terrifying, but controlled. But the most chilling aspect for Woodcock was the sound that began to emanate from the empty air. It started as a low, guttural growl, distinct from any animal native to the region. The growling evolved into a voice. It was a gruff, masculine voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It did not originate from Dinah's mouth. Witnesses, including Woodcock, observed her closely while the voice spoke. Her lips did not move, and the sound often came from a corner of the room or from the ceiling. The voice was abusive and vulgar. It shouted obscenities at the family, mocked their fear, and made specific threats. It seemed to know things about the neighbors that no one else knew, revealing secrets that caused embarrassment and shock among the witnesses. This marked a turning point in the haunting. It was no longer just a force, it was a personality. Woodcock decided to engage the voice directly. He treated it not as a ghost, but as an intelligence that could be reasoned with or at least analyzed. He asked the entity what it was. The voice responded with a barrage of profanity, calling itself the devil. It claimed it was there to torment the family until they were driven out. Woodcock remained calm, recording the dialogue in his notes. He challenged the entity, asking it to perform specific tasks to prove its power. On one occasion, he asked the entity to retrieve a piece of paper he had marked and placed in a different location. Moments later, the paper drifted down from the ceiling, landing at his feet. The interaction between the artist and the invisible presence became a bizarre battle of wills. The sheer number of witnesses grew daily. People traveled from Ottawa and surrounding townships, clogging the road to the Dag farm. They crowded into the house, hoping to see a chair move or hear the voice. The farmhouse became a theater of the impossible. One witness, a local magistrate, watched as a pane of glass in the window shattered inward, yet the shards of glass remained on the sill, not scattering onto the floor. Another witness reported seeing a heavy dining table lift entirely off the ground while three men tried to hold it down. The force required to lift it against their resistance was immense. Through it all, the Dag family tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the strain was visible on their faces. George was losing weight, and Susan was perpetually on the verge of collapse. The voice began to show a strange duality. While it spent hours cursing and threatening, there were moments where it shifted tone completely. In one instance, while Woodcock was present, the voice began to sing. It did not sing a bawdy tavern song, but a hymn. The sound was high and clear, completely different from the gruff growl that usually terrorized the house. It sang "Nearer, My God, to Thee" with perfect pitch. The witnesses in the room were stunned into silence. The entity then engaged in a theological debate with Woodcock, discussing scripture and morality. This contradiction baffled the investigator. How could something that threw stones and started fires also sing hymns and discuss God? It added a layer of psychological complexity that made the case unique. Dinah, the young girl at the center, was often the target of the voice's duality. It would threaten to hurt her one moment, and then later it would claim to be her protector. Woodcock observed that the entity seemed possessive of the child. When Dinah was sent to a neighbor's house to sleep, hoping to give her some rest, the activity often ceased at the Dag farm, only to start up mildly at the neighbor's location. However, the most violent manifestations remained tied to the farmhouse itself. It was as if the energy required the combination of the location and the girl to reach its full potential. The psychological toll on Dinah was immense, yet she remained surprisingly resilient, often describing the presence as something she could feel before it acted. As December approached, the intensity of the haunting reached its peak. The fires had stopped, likely because the family had removed almost every flammable item they could spare, but the verbal harassment was constant. The entity began to claim that its time was short. It told Woodcock that it would be leaving soon. The reasons it gave were vague and conflicting. Sometimes it said it had completed its work, other times it claimed it was being forced out by a higher power. Woodcock pressed for a specific time and date. The voice gave a date in mid-November, but that passed with no change. Then it gave a date in early December. The unpredictability kept the family in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing if the quiet moments were the end or just a pause before a bigger storm. The physical phenomena became more aggressive toward visitors who mocked it. A man who laughed at the stories and dared the ghost to show itself was immediately struck in the face by a wet rag that materialized out of thin air. The rag was cold and smelled of swamp water. Another skeptic was hit by a stone that left a visible bruise on his arm. These targeted attacks served to validate the stories for the doubters. It was not just random energy, it was reactive. It listened. It understood context. It had a temper. The Dag farm had effectively become a place where the laws of nature were suspended, and the community had to accept that there was something happening in their midst that their religion and their science could not explain. One particular afternoon, the farmhouse was packed with 17 witnesses. They included neighbors, family members, and curious travelers. The activity was relentless. Stones were thumping against the walls, voices were shouting from the corners, and objects were dancing on the tables. Woodcock realized the importance of this moment. He knew that once the haunting ended, people would claim it was mass hysteria or a tall tale. He decided to draft a legal document. It was a statement of facts, detailing exactly what they had seen and heard. He wrote down the descriptions of the fires, the stone throwing, and the voice. He read it aloud to the room, asking if everyone agreed that this was an accurate account of their experience. Every person in the room agreed. One by one, they signed the document. It was a remarkable moment in the history of paranormal investigation, a sworn affidavit signed by 17 credible witnesses attesting to the reality of the impossible. They were farmers, laborers, and respected community members, putting their names to a paper that declared they had seen chairs move and heard a disembodied voice. They knew they might be ridiculed, but the immediacy of the experience compelled them to sign. They wanted it on record that the Dagg family was not lying. They wanted it known that they had stood in that cold farmhouse and witnessed things that should not be. Shortly after the signing of the statement, the activity began to wane. The voice spoke less frequently, its tone losing the aggressive edge that had defined it for weeks. The stones stopped falling. The furniture remained in place. The transition was not sudden, but a slow fading, like a storm blowing itself out. The entity, which had once dominated every hour of the day, became a sporadic nuisance, then a memory. By the deep winter of 1890, the Dagg farmhouse was quiet. The family, traumatized and exhausted, tentatively began to move their lives back to normal. They repaired the broken windows and scrubbed the scorch marks from the floors. They brought the furniture back in, testing it to see if it would stay put. The departure of the entity left a vacuum of silence that was almost as unsettling as the noise. George Dagg never fully recovered his sense of security. He had seen his home turned into a battleground against an invisible enemy. Susan Dagg remained vigilant, watching the children for any sign that the presence had returned. Dinah, the focus of so much of the energy, grew up and eventually moved away, living a life that was largely quiet and unremarkable, a stark contrast to the chaos of her childhood. She rarely spoke of the events publicly in her later years, perhaps wishing to leave the darkness behind in Clarendon. Percy Woodcock left the farm with his notebook filled and his worldview shaken. He had come to expose a fraud and left as a believer in the unexplained. He championed the story not as a campfire tale, but as a documented case of spiritual interaction. He published his account detailing the conversations with the voice and the behavior of the thing. His report remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of a poltergeist outbreak from that era. He emphasized the intelligence of the entity, the way it played with them, and the distinct lack of fear it showed toward religious intervention. It was a puzzle he never solved, only observed. The Dagg haunting, or the Dagg poltergeist, as it came to be known in quieter circles, faded from national headlines but remained a potent legend in the Ottawa Valley. It was never solved. No trickwires were ever found, no ventriloquist was ever discovered. The sheer duration of the event, lasting several months, and the variety of phenomena from fire to sound to physical force made it difficult to dismiss as a simple prank. Pranks usually have a punchline or a profit motive. This had neither. It only brought destruction and terror to a poor farming family. The signed statement by the 17 witnesses sits in archives as a stubborn piece of evidence, a piece of paper that insists that for one winter in Quebec, the impossible became real. In the years that followed, the story was often retold in the region, passed down through generations of families who had been there or knew someone who had. The farmhouse eventually fell into disrepair, reclaimed by the harsh Canadian elements that had battered it during that long winter. But the core of the mystery remained. The entity had claimed to be a devil, then sang hymns. It had thrown stones to hurt, then claimed to protect the child. It was a mass of contradictions that mirrored the human mind, leading some to speculate on the psychic connection between Dinah and the energy. Was it an external spirit? Or was it a manifestation of the stress and repressed energy of a young girl living in a hard environment? Is less than has hone. Zero hash is greater than. Modern researchers looking back at the Dagg case point to the recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis theory, suggesting that Dinah was the unwitting agent of the chaos. The movement of objects, the fires, even the voice could be interpreted as a projection of adolescent turmoil. But this theory struggles to explain the shared auditory hallucinations, if that is what they were, or the physical bruises left on skeptics. The information provided by the voice regarding the secrets of the neighbors suggests an intelligence that had access to knowledge Dinah could not possibly have possessed. The mud incident, where sludge appeared from nowhere, and the spontaneous fires remain difficult to categorize under simple telekinesis. The legacy of the Dag haunting is one of unease. It sits uncomfortably in history, a verified event with no verified explanation. It is a story about the fragility of domestic safety, about how quickly a home can become a prison. The image of the family huddled in a shed while stones rain down from a clear sky is a potent reminder of their helplessness. They were besieged by an unseen force that operated by its own rules, a force that could not be shot, arrested, or reasoned with. The neutrality of the winter landscape, the white snow and the gray sky, provided a blank canvas for a terror that was vivid and loud. Today, the location of the farm is quiet. The intense energy that once boiled there has long since dissipated into the earth, but the records remain. The testimony of the local minister, the sketches by Woodcock, and the newspaper reports from the era form a mosaic of a haunting that was undeniably physical. It was not a ghost story of fleeting shadows and cold spots. It was a violent, noisy intrusion into reality. The Dag family survived it, but they did not conquer it. They simply endured until it chose to leave, and that lack of resolution is perhaps the most disturbing element of all. It implies that such things can happen, can tear a life apart, and then simply vanish, leaving the victims to sweep up the glass and wonder why. The incident serves as a historical bookmark in the study of Canadian folklore and paranormal research. It occurred in an era where superstition and nascent scientific inquiry often overlapped. The people involved were not seeking fame, they were seeking survival. The witnesses were not looking for ghosts, they were looking for answers. What they found was a void that looked back at them, a voice that knew their names, and a fire that started without a match. It remains a definitive, if often overlooked, example of the raw, chaotic nature of the poltergeist phenomenon, stripped of Gothic romance and left bare in the cold light of a Quebec winter.